Close your eyes if you like, and let your shoulders drop, and let your breathing settle into something slower than the pace of the day you have just finished. Tonight, this documentary is going to take you somewhere strange. Not frightening, not urgent, nothing that needs your alertness at all, but genuinely, quietly strange, in a way that British history is very good at being, when you stop and look closely at the things sitting just out of sight. So, come with this documentary, gently, to a stretch of grey water a few miles off the coast of England, where the Thames widens out into its estuary, and the land finally gives up and lets the sea take over. The water there is the colour of an overcast afternoon, restless in the way shallow northern seas are always restless, and if you were standing on the deck of a small boat crossing it, you would eventually see something rise up out of that water that does not belong to any category your mind keeps ready for the ocean. It is not a ship. It is not a lighthouse, not quite. It is a cluster of rust-streaked steel towers, standing on thin legs above the waves, connected by narrow catwalks, tilting very slightly, the way old iron structures tilt when they have spent decades absorbing the push of tides that never stop pushing. Seabirds nest in its window frames. The paint, what is left of it, has gone the colour of a bruise healing. And if you sat with that image for long enough, really sat with it, the way this documentary hopes you will sit with all of its images tonight, you would start to sense that a structure like this does not simply appear in the middle of the sea by accident. Someone had to want it there badly enough to build it there. Someone had to carry every ton of steel and concrete out across open water and set it down on a sandbank, on purpose, deliberately, at considerable cost and considerable risk. And the story of Why Is the Story, this documentary, is going to spend the next couple of hours telling you, slowly, without hurry, the way all of this channel's stories get told, because that tower and the 5 or 6 others scattered near it, around the mouths of the Thames and the Mersey, began their lives as something close to a promise made by a frightened, blacked-out country to itself. In the early years of a war, it was not yet sure it would win, that the sky above its 2 great river approaches would not simply be left open to whatever came flying up the water in the dark. They were gun platforms, homes for a while to well over 100 men each, living out on the open sea in conditions that would test anyone's patience and anyone's nerve, watching the horizon for engines that meant bombers, or for the smaller, stranger silhouette of pilotless flying bombs skimming low over the water toward London. That is where this story begins, and if it stopped there, it would already be worth telling. But it does not stop there, because when the guns fell silent, and the war that justified those towers ended, and the Navy and the Army who had built and staffed them quietly lost interest and sailed away and left them standing empty on their sandbanks, something else moved in. Not soldiers this time, young men with record players, renegade broadcasters who realised that a structure built to keep enemies at bay from Britain was, by a strange accident of maritime law, sitting just outside the reach of Britain's own broadcasting rules. And so, these same grim wartime platforms became, for a few restless years in the middle 1960s, something closer to floating nightclubs, pirate radio stations blaring pop music and rock and roll out across southern England to a generation of teenagers the BBC had never quite worked out how to talk to. Skull and crossbones flags were run up their flagpoles. Transmitters salvaged, by more than one account, from a wartime bomber were bolted into rooms that had once held anti-aircraft crews. And on at least one of these towers, a small, strange, genuinely astonishing thing happened afterward. A thing this documentary promises to walk you through in full later tonight, because one of these forts, alone among all of them, was not simply abandoned or demolished when its broadcasting days ended. It was declared by the man living on it to be its own country, a sovereign nation with its own flag, its own currency, its own self-appointed royal family, sitting quietly a few miles off the English coast for more than half a century since, never recognized by a single government on Earth, and yet never quite gone away either. Think for just a moment longer about the sheer improbability of that sentence before this documentary moves on. A rusting military structure built by a frightened government under enemy bombardment, later claimed as sovereign territory by a private citizen, and never once, in more than 50 years, dislodged, disproven, or definitively resolved, one way or the other, by any court, any parliament, any navy. Britain is a country with a very long, very careful relationship with the idea of sovereignty. An old country, a country that has spent centuries refining exactly what it means for land and water and law to belong to someone. And somewhere in the middle of all that careful ancient machinery, a fisherman from Essex found a gap just wide enough to stand in and simply stood there and stayed. This documentary finds that thought worth sitting with quietly before the story properly begins. Gun platform, outlaw radio kingdom, self-declared micronation, three entirely different lives lived out in sequence by structures of concrete and steel that most people driving along the Essex or Kent coastline today have never even heard of, let alone looked out to sea and noticed. You may know a little about pirate radio already, and if you are picturing a ship rolling gently at anchor, playing records into a microphone somewhere off the Essex coast, hold that image loosely tonight, because it belongs to only part of this story and not the part you are about to hear. Tonight is about the forts, the strange, spindly, half-forgotten towers, and the improbable, carefully documented, occasionally very sad and occasionally very funny, true story of the men who built them, broadcast from them, fought over them, and in one remarkable case, tried to turn one of them into a kingdom of his own. Settle in. There is no need to follow every date or every name closely tonight. Let this documentary hold that weight for you. Your only task for the next little while is to listen and to let yourself drift out across that grey water toward the towers. Before this documentary can take you out to the towers themselves, it needs to introduce you to the man who drew them, because his story is a quieter, gentler kind of strange, and it deserves its own space before the war and the pirates and the kingdom arrive. His name was Guy Anson Maunsell, and if you went looking for him in the history of British engineering, you would find him remembered by the people who take that history seriously as a genuinely significant figure in 20th century civil engineering, and yet remembered by almost everyone else, if he is remembered at all, for a handful of strange steel platforms he designed almost as a side project in the middle of a war under enormous pressure in a matter of months. That gap between how he is remembered by specialists and how he is remembered by everyone else is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something true about how history actually keeps its records. The things that turn out to be famous are very often not the things their creators would have chosen to be famous for. Guy Maunsell was born on the 1st of September 1884, a very long way from the grey estuaries of southern England, in Srinagar, in Kashmir, then part of British India, into a family with deep roots in military service. It is worth pausing on that detail because it is easy, telling this story backward from the war, to imagine an engineer who grew up thinking about concrete and steel from childhood. That is not quite what happened. He grew up in the world of the British Raj, in a family accustomed to service and to distance from home, the kind of upbringing that produced, again and again in this period of British history, young men who moved fluidly between countries and disciplines because empire required exactly that kind of adaptability of them. When the time came for his professional training, young Maunsell did not go to Oxford or Cambridge in the way you might expect of a man who would go on to shape British infrastructure. He trained in civil engineering at the Central Institution of the City and Guilds of London Institute, based in South Kensington, a serious, technically rigorous institution, if a less romantic name than the ancient universities, built specifically to produce practicing engineers rather than gentlemen scholars. And then in the years around 1907 and 1908, he went further still, taking practical training on the continent, in Paris and in Lausanne, immersing himself in European engineering practice at a moment when concrete construction techniques were advancing rapidly on the continent, arguably faster than they were in Britain itself. So, by the time Guy Maunsell entered his working life in earnest, he was already, in a sense, an internationally formed engineer, Indian-born, London-trained, continentally polished, carrying an unusually broad base of experience into a career that would eventually run for more than 5 decades. Between that continental training and the outbreak of the Second World War lay several decades of steady, patient professional work, the kind that rarely produces dramatic anecdotes, but that quietly builds the judgment a good engineer eventually relies on when a genuine emergency arrives. Maunsell moved through those years the way most serious engineers of his generation did, taking on projects, refining his understanding of materials and loads and foundations, building a reputation among the people who mattered most in his own profession, even as his name meant nothing at all to the wider public. It is worth remembering that reputation, because it is precisely what made the government turn to him specifically when the crisis of the early 1940s arrived and someone was needed who could be trusted to solve an entirely unprecedented engineering problem under enormous time pressure without the luxury of years to get it right. It is tempting in a documentary like this one to rush straight past a man's early career toward the one dramatic chapter everyone actually wants to hear about. This documentary is going to resist that temptation gently for just a little longer, because Maunsell's working life before the war, and indeed for a long stretch after it, was built on bridges, not gun platforms. Across the decades of his career, he worked on major engineering projects around bridge design and construction, developing a genuine expertise in reinforced and eventually pre-stressed concrete at a time when that material was still relatively new to serious structural engineering in Britain, still being tested, still being argued over in professional journals as to whether it could really be trusted the way steel had long been trusted. Maunsell became one of the engineers pushing that argument forward patiently through the unglamorous, invisible work of getting the numbers right. And it was not until 1955, think about that for a moment, because it means Maunsell was already 70 years old, an age at which a great many people have long since retired to their gardens, that he founded his own engineering practice and truly became a leading figure in pre-stressed concrete bridge design in Britain. In the eyes of his professional peers, that later chapter of his career, built on decades of accumulated technical judgment, was arguably the more important one. It represented mastery. It represented the culmination of a long, patient engineering life. And yet, if you say the name Maunsell today to anyone outside the engineering profession, to a birdwatcher on the Kent coast, to a fisherman working the Thames estuary, to anyone who has ever looked out at those rusting towers and asked what on earth they are, the answer that comes back will almost never mention bridges. It will mention the forts, because in 1941, in his late 50s, at a moment of genuine national emergency, Guy Maunsell was asked to solve an urgent and highly unusual engineering problem. How do you place effective anti-aircraft artillery in the middle of a tidal estuary, on shifting sand, in water too shallow for a conventional ship, and too deep and too soft for a conventional foundation, and do it fast enough to matter before the bombers arrived again? His answer, a family of designs that will occupy a great deal of this documentary's attention in the chapters ahead, was audacious, practical, and by any honest measure, brilliant. It is a small, quiet irony that this documentary wants you to hold on to as it moves forward tonight, that the work Maunsell would spend the second half of his career refining and deepening, the bridges, the pre-stressed concrete, the steady accumulation of professional mastery, is largely unknown outside engineering circles, while the work he dashed off under wartime pressure in his late 50s, a handful of strange towers meant to last only as long as the war did, became, almost by accident, the thing his name is actually attached to in the popular imagination. Guy Mounsell died on the 20th of June 1961, having lived to see his wartime forts already drifting toward obsolescence and neglect, without any way of knowing that they were, in fact, only just beginning their second and third acts. This documentary will return to him only briefly again. After this, his part in the story is largely done once the design leaves his hands. But it felt right, before going further, to let you meet the engineer properly, as a whole man with a whole career, rather than simply as a name attached to a curiosity. Now, this documentary wants to introduce you to a very different kind of man entirely, because the forts do not stay quiet and military for very long in this story, and the person who first breaks that silence is one of the more colourful characters British popular culture produced in the 20th century. His name, at least the name he performed under, was Screaming Lord Such. Born David Such, he became, over the course of his life, a genuinely singular figure in British entertainment and politics, of a rock and roll showman, known for wild stage theatrics decades before that sort of thing was common, arriving at gigs in coffins, wearing horns and leopard skin, and in an entirely separate and equally sincere pursuit that ran alongside his music for the rest of his life, standing as a fringe parliamentary candidate in election after election, representing what eventually became the official monster raving loony party, losing every single time and somehow becoming, by sheer persistence and good humour, a beloved fixture of British election nights regardless. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who would look at a semi-abandoned wartime gun platform sitting in international waters off the coast of Kent and see not a rusting military relic, but an opportunity. And so, on the 27th of May 1964, Screaming Lord Such launched Radio Such, broadcasting from the Shivering Sands Fort, one of the Army's cluster platforms out in the Thames estuary, which this documentary will describe to you properly, tower by tower, in the chapter just ahead. The operation, by every account that survives of it, was gloriously, almost comically improvised. This was not a slick commercial enterprise moving into a professional broadcast facility. It was closer to a group of enthusiastic amateurs breaking into an abandoned building and simply deciding to make it work. The transmitter itself is reported, in more than one telling of the story, to have been salvaged from a wartime Handley Page Halifax bomber, repurposed wartime hardware, quite literally, being used to broadcast pop music from a wartime gun platform, which is the kind of detail that sounds almost too neat to be true, and yet keeps appearing across the record of that summer. Power came from car batteries hauled out to the fort and wired up to keep the station on the air. And flying above it all, in case the whole enterprise needed one more flourish of theatre, was a skull and crossbones flag run up the mast in cheerful, deliberate self-parody of the piracy the British government would soon start taking rather more seriously than Such himself ever seemed to. Try for a moment to picture what it must actually have felt like to be aboard Shivering Sands in those first weeks in the late spring of 1964. A handful of young men, out on a rusting steel platform, far from shore, wiring up salvaged bomber equipment by hand, running cables across catwalks that had been designed for anti-aircraft crews rather than broadcasters, checking and rechecking a signal that depended entirely on car batteries holding their charge through the damp sea air. There would have been real discomfort in it. Cold nights, cramped quarters, the constant low anxiety of equipment that might fail at any moment, far from any easy help. And yet there would also have been something genuinely thrilling in it too. This documentary imagines a sense of getting away with something, of turning a forgotten piece of wartime hardware into a small, defiant act of musical rebellion against a broadcasting establishment that had never once asked what these young listeners actually wanted to hear. Radio Such played pop music and rock and roll to a young British audience that the BBC, with its cautious, heavily rationed approach to that kind of programming, was simply not serving. But Such's own involvement in running the station did not last especially long. By September of 1964, only a few months after that first broadcast, he sold the station, reportedly for something in the region of £5,000, a figure this documentary offers to you gently, the way most figures from this loosely documented corner of British broadcasting history need to be offered, as a widely repeated number, rather than an audited fact. And the buyer was, in one of those small ironic turns this story keeps producing, his own manager. A man named Reginald Calvert. Calvert relaunched the operation as Radio City, giving it the tagline, "Your Tower of Power," and under his stewardship, it grew into a rather more professional, more ambitious broadcasting concern than Such's original shoestring venture had ever quite managed to be. This documentary is going to spend real time with Reginald Calvert later tonight in a chapter of its own, because his story does not end quietly. It ends, in fact, in one of the more genuinely startling and genuinely sad episodes in the whole of this history, a violent confrontation 2 years on from this point that this documentary will walk you through slowly and carefully when its proper place in the timeline arrives. For now, though, this documentary wants only to plant that seed gently and let it sit unresolved the way it sat for the people living through it in real time in 1964, with absolutely no idea what was coming. Calvert, at this point in the story, is simply an ambitious young music manager who has just taken over a fort in the Thames estuary and turned it into a more serious broadcasting operation than the wild improvised station Screaming Lord Such had built there. That is where this documentary is going to leave him for now. It is worth pausing before moving on to notice what these two men actually represent together, because their brief partnership captures something true about the whole pirate radio movement that grew up around these forts in the years that followed. On one side, you have Such, a showman drawn to spectacle for its own sake, delighted by the sheer theatre of broadcasting pop music from a rusting wartime tower under a pirate flag, seemingly unbothered by whether the enterprise made commercial sense in the long run. On the other, you have Calvert, more businesslike, more interested in building something that would actually last and actually earn money, willing to take Such's improvised stunt and turn it into a working commercial radio station. That tension between spectacle and sustainability, between outlaw theatre and genuine broadcasting ambition, runs through almost everything that happened on these forts over the following 3 years, and you will see it again and again as this documentary introduces you to the other stations that rose and fell out on the water alongside Radio City. For now, simply hold on to these two names, Such, who started it, and Calvert, who took it further, and who this documentary will meet again under much darker circumstances before the night is through. There is one more man this documentary needs you to meet before it can properly begin the story it promised you in the opening minutes, the story of the tower that became a kingdom. His name was Paddy Roy Bates, and if this documentary told you nothing else about him, except what happens later in his life, you would already suspect he must have been an unusual person. But it is worth slowing down and meeting him as a young man first, because the strangeness of what he eventually did makes far more sense once you understand the kind of life that came before it. Roy Bates was born on the 29th of August, 1921, in Ealing in Middlesex, on the western edge of London. An ordinary enough beginning, in an ordinary enough part of England, for a man whose life would end up being anything but ordinary. When the Second World War came, Bates served in the British Army, and served by every account with real distinction. He reached the rank of Major, fighting with the 8th Army through the brutal campaigns of North Africa, and later in the desperately hard fighting in Italy around Monte Cassino, one of the most costly and most fiercely contested battles the British and Allied forces faced in the whole Italian campaign. He was wounded more than once in the course of that service. This is not a small detail to pass over quickly. A man who has commanded troops under fire, who has been wounded fighting for his country, who has watched the machinery of war up close for years. That is a very particular kind of formation for a personality, and it is worth keeping in mind as this documentary follows Bates forward into peacetime, because a certain fearlessness, a certain willingness to stand his ground under pressure that most people would simply avoid, seems to have stayed with him for the rest of his life. After the war, Bates settled into a quieter, more conventional existence, at least on the surface, working as a fisherman and a businessman in Essex, along the same stretch of English coastline that would later become so important to his story. Picture that life for a moment, because it is worth picturing properly before this documentary pulls you away from it again. A man in his 30s, standing on the deck of a small fishing boat somewhere off the low, flat Essex coast, hauling nets in the cold, doing the same patient, physical, unglamorous work that generations of men along that shoreline had done before him, in the same tides, under much the same grey sky this documentary described to you at the very start of Tonight. There is nothing in that picture, on its own, that suggests a future prince of anything. And yet Bates was, by most descriptions that survive of him from this period, restless in the particular way that some former military men are restless in civilian life, capable, energetic, always looking for the next project, never entirely at ease with the smaller scale of ordinary peacetime ambitions, after years spent commanding men and making decisions that genuinely mattered under fire. Fishing paid the bills and business ventures came and went, but neither one seems to have been quite enough on its own to hold the whole of a personality this documentary keeps describing to you as fearless and stubborn and hungry for something larger than the ordinary run of English coastal life could offer him. And it was that restlessness, that hunger for something bigger than the everyday, that eventually pulled him toward the same strange improvised world. Screaming Lord Such and Reginald Calvert had already stumbled into Out on the Water, a world where a wartime relic sitting empty in the tide could, with enough nerve, be turned into something new. Bates entered the world of offshore pirate radio through a station called Radio Essex, broadcasting from a fort called Knock John. Now, this documentary wants to be very careful with you here, because it is remarkably easy, in less careful retellings of this history, to blur several different forts together into one vague, undifferentiated idea of a tower in the sea, and that blurring genuinely distorts the story. Knock John was a navy fort, built to a different design than the army fort at Shivering Sands, where Such and Calvert had built Radio City, and this documentary will explain exactly how those two designs differed in careful detail in the chapter just ahead. And Knock John was, importantly, a different fort again from a place called Ruff's Tower, a fort this documentary has not mentioned yet, but which is going to become, before this night is through, the single most important location in this entire story. Keep those three names loosely separate in your mind as this documentary goes forward. Shivering Sands, where Such and Calvert began their story. Knock John, where Bates began his. And Ruff's Tower, waiting quietly out on the water for the story it is going to end up carrying. For now, this documentary is going to do to Roy Bates exactly what it just did to Reginald Calvert a few minutes ago. Plant a seed and let it sit unresolved while the wider context of the war and the pirate radio movement gets properly filled in first, because what Roy Bates eventually does several years after this quiet beginning on Knock John is genuinely without parallel anywhere else in this story, or arguably anywhere else in modern British history. He is going to take one of these abandoned wartime platforms and declare it quite seriously, quite deliberately, and with a straight face that never really wavered for the rest of his long life, to be an independent sovereign nation. A tiny self-proclaimed royal family ruling a steel platform a few miles off the Suffolk coast, recognised by no government on earth, and yet still standing, still claimed, still occupied more than half a century later. That is where this thread of the story is heading. This documentary simply wanted you to meet the man first, the fisherman, the wounded veteran of North Africa and Monte Cassino, the restless Essex businessman with a taste for pirate radio, before it asks you to believe what he does next. Now, this documentary wants to take you back properly to the beginning, to the war itself, and to the very specific, very practical problem that made Guy Mounsel's strange towers necessary in the first place. Because nothing about these forts makes sense until you understand exactly what they were built to stop, and exactly why the usual answers to that kind of problem simply would not work here. By the early 1940s, Britain's two great commercial and naval river approaches, the Thames leading up toward London and the Mersey leading up toward Liverpool, had become dangerously exposed. German aircraft used the wide, flat expanse of these estuaries as navigational highways, flying low over the water under cover of darkness, dropping magnetic and acoustic mines into the shipping channels to cripple the vital convoy traffic moving in and out of Britain's two busiest ports, and pressing on toward the cities themselves as part of the wider bombing campaign. The problem from a defensive standpoint was that these estuaries were simply too wide, too open, and too far from the coast for conventional land-based anti-aircraft guns to cover effectively. You needed guns out on the water itself, positioned along the flight paths the German aircraft were actually using. But you could not simply anchor a warship there permanently. Warships were needed elsewhere, and a stationary gun platform sitting on visible moorings for months on end was not remotely what the Royal Navy had ships for. What was needed was something new, a permanent, purpose-built gun platform sunk directly onto the shallow sandbanks of the estuaries themselves, requiring no crew to sail it and no engine to maintain, simply standing there indefinitely doing one job. This is the problem Guy Mounsell was asked to solve, and it is worth understanding that he did not produce one single design, but two genuinely distinct families of structure, built for two different services, and it is easy, in less careful accounts, to blur the two together. This documentary does not want to blur them for you. The Navy forts came first in the sequence of construction, and there were 4 of them in total, all positioned in the Thames estuary. Their design was, in essence, a rectangular, reinforced concrete pontoon hull, an enormous hollow concrete barge, in effect, prefabricated entirely on land, then towed out complete to its final position, and deliberately sunk onto the seabed, where it settled and became permanently part of the landscape. Rising up from that sunk pontoon hull were twin cylindrical concrete towers, each roughly 60 feet tall and about 24 feet in diameter, connected across the top by a deck that housed the gun crew's living quarters and the fort's operational spaces. Each of these Navy forts weighed in the region of 4,500 tons. Their names were Rough Sands, also known as H.M. Fort Roughs, grounded in February of 1942, and this documentary asks you to remember that name, Roughs Tower, because it is going to matter enormously later tonight. Sunkhead, grounded in June of 1942, Tongue Sands, also grounded in June of 1942, and Knock John, grounded in August of 1942, the very fort where Roy Bates would later begin his own pirate radio career. Broadly speaking, the Navy forts were essentially all in place by the late summer of 1942, a remarkably fast and coordinated construction effort for wartime Britain. The army forts were a different design altogether, and they arrived in at least one important case considerably later. Rather than a single sunk pontoon topped by 2 towers, each army fort was a cluster of 7 separate steel platforms, standing on stilts above the water, arranged with a clear tactical logic. 4 gun towers set out in a rough semicircle, together with a control tower, a tower for a Bofors anti-aircraft gun, and a tower carrying a searchlight, the whole cluster linked together by a network of narrow steel catwalks so that men could move between towers without needing a boat. Each individual tower stood on 4 steel legs driven roughly 160 feet into the seabed. There were 6 army forts in total, 3 protecting the Thames, named Nore, Red Sands and Shivering Sands, and 3 protecting the Mersey, named Queens, Formby and Burbo. And here this documentary wants to correct a framing you will sometimes see repeated without much scrutiny, the idea that all of these forts, Navy and Army alike, simply appeared on the water simultaneously as part of one single, tidy construction program. They did not. While the Navy forts were largely complete by the late summer of 1942, at least one of the Army forts, Shivering Sands, was not actually grounded in its final position until late in 1943, well over a year later. This was a rolling, evolving wartime effort, not a single coordinated moment, and this documentary thinks that detail is worth preserving rather than smoothing away for the sake of a simpler story. As for armament, the Navy forts each carried twin QF 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns, along with 2 40mm Bofors guns and radar equipment to help direct their fire in poor visibility. The Army forts each carried 4 QF 3.7-inch guns, one mounted on each of the 4 gun towers in the semicircle, along with their own Bofors armament for closer-range targets like low-flying aircraft. Now, on the question of exactly how many men lived and worked on each of these forts, this documentary is going to be honest with you rather than confident, because the surviving sources genuinely disagree with one another, and pretending otherwise would only be dishonest tidiness. Some accounts put the Army forts at around 165 men, others put the figure closer to 120. Estimates for the Navy forts vary similarly, with some describing roughly 120 men per fort, and others, specifically for Ruff's Tower, offering a vaguer range, somewhere between 150 and 300 men rotating through over time. Rather than hand you a single false precision number, this documentary is simply going to tell you what seems safely true across all of these accounts. These were well-populated, genuinely crowded outposts, holding well over 100 men each, sometimes closer to 200, living in rotation, cut off from land, exposed to the weather, doing a hard and often tedious job. And what, in the end, did all of this actually achieve? This is another place where this documentary wants to hedge carefully, rather than repeat a number, simply because it is the number that keeps getting repeated. The forts are widely credited with shooting down some 22 enemy aircraft over the course of the war, along with something in the range of 20 to 30 V-1 flying bombs during the later, more desperate phase of the German bombing campaign, when pilotless bombs began skimming in low over the estuary toward London. There is also a specific, dramatic episode often told about the night of the 22nd and 23rd of January 1945, when gunfire from Tongue Sands is said to have forced one German E-boat into colliding with another, which was then scuttled by its own crew. These are genuinely striking claims, and this documentary is not going to pretend they are false. But it also cannot, in good conscience, present them to you as an audited, independently verified military record, because that record does not appear to exist in any form this documentary's research was able to independently confirm. Every version of these figures traces back to the same underlying, largely uncited claims, repeated from source to source, without an independent primary record ever quite surfacing behind them. So this documentary will say it exactly the way the evidence actually supports saying it. The forts are credited with this record, not verified as having achieved it, down to the last aircraft and the last flying bomb. Credited with it by a long tradition of retelling that this documentary has no particular reason to doubt in its broad outline, but no reliable way to confirm in its precise arithmetic either. One thing at least is not disputed anywhere in the record. The Mersey forts, the 3 towers, guarding Liverpool's approaches, never saw enemy action at all. No combat record, contested or otherwise, exists for them. They stood their long, quiet watch over the Mersey estuary for years, and the war simply never came to test them. War, once it ends, has a way of leaving its machinery behind, standing there in the landscape long after the urgency that built it has drained away, and that is exactly what happened to these forts. This documentary wants to walk you through that quiet decline, slowly, because it is easy to imagine the forts being simply switched off the day the war ended, and that is not really what happened. It was a gradual, uneven process, stretched out across roughly a decade, and understanding exactly how it unfolded matters enormously for what comes next in this story. Military use of the forts had already begun winding down from around the middle of the 1940s, as the threat that justified them receded. But decommissioning in the formal sense and abandonment in the practical sense are two different things, and they happened on very different timelines for different forts. Some Navy forts were formally decommissioned as early as 1945, right at the close of the war, but that formal decommissioning did not mean the forts were simply emptied overnight. Several of them continued to be staffed by small skeleton crews for years afterward, maintained in some reduced capacity even after their formal military purpose had ended. Knockjohn, the fort where Roy Bates would later launch Radio Essex, was maintained by the Navy all the way until May of 1956. Sunkhead was abandoned in 1956 as well. Tongue Sands, by contrast, had already been left by 1949, considerably earlier than the other two. The Mersey Army forts followed a different path entirely. Rather than simply being left in place, they were actively demolished by 1955, because unlike the Thames forts, they sat close enough to Liverpool's busy shipping lanes that leaving them standing posed a genuine hazard to navigation. That distinction between forts that were simply left standing and forts that were actively torn down is worth understanding on its own terms, because the logic behind it was entirely practical rather than sentimental. The wartime threat had passed, certainly, but demolishing a massive steel or concrete structure out in open water is itself a difficult and expensive undertaking, requiring specialist engineering effort for a job with no urgent deadline behind it anymore. So in most cases where a fort did not actively block a shipping channel or threaten navigation, the simplest and cheapest option from the government's perspective was simply to leave it exactly where it was. Not preserved, not maintained, not really cared for in any meaningful sense, just left, standing empty on its sandbank, slowly rusting, slowly being reclaimed by seabirds and salt air, quietly disappearing from official attention, even as it remained, stubbornly, physically present on the water. Try to picture what that meant, in practice, for the handful of years these towers spent simply standing there, unattended, waiting for the next chapter of their story to find them. No maintenance crews, no painters keeping the rust at bay, no engineers checking the steel legs for corrosion or the gun towers for structural fatigue, just salt spray and wind and the slow, patient work of a hostile marine environment, doing to abandoned military hardware exactly what it does to any piece of unmaintained steel left standing in open water for long enough. And yet these structures had been built to withstand a war, over-engineered by necessity, by men working under wartime pressure who could not afford a design that might fail under fire. And it was precisely that wartime over-engineering, this documentary suspects, which is the real reason these towers were still sturdy enough, years later, to support determined young broadcasters, their equipment, their generators, and, in due course, an entire self-declared nation. And it is that condition, abandoned, unmaintained, but still structurally standing, still perfectly serviceable as a platform for a transmitter and a generator and a handful of determined young men with a record collection, that made these forts so attractive to the pirate broadcasters who arrived in the following decade, But there is a second, entirely separate reason the forts became so attractive, and this documentary wants to walk you through it carefully because it turns on a genuinely important legal detail that is going to keep mattering again and again for the rest of this story. At the time these forts were built and then abandoned, Britain's territorial sea, the belt of ocean around the country's coastline over which British law was recognised as applying, extended only 3 nautical miles from shore. Beyond that 3-mile line lay international waters, governed by no single nation's domestic law. Now, most of these forts, sitting several miles out in their respective estuaries, fell outside that 3-mile limit in international waters beyond the reach of British broadcasting regulation. There was one clear exception worth noting. The Nore Fort, unusually, had actually been built within British territorial waters, even at the time of its construction, closer to shore than the others. But the rest generally sat outside the 3-mile line, and it was precisely that gap, that stretch of legally ungoverned water, which the pirate broadcasters of the coming chapters would learn to exploit with real enthusiasm. This documentary wants to add one important complication here, though, because this was never quite as stable or as simple a legal picture as it might sound, and it is going to matter directly when this documentary reaches the story of Radio City's closure a little later tonight. In 1967, the Post Office and the Crown successfully argued in a British court that the Thames estuary itself legally qualified as a bay under the rules of the Geneva Convention on the Law of the Sea, and further, that an exposed sandbank counted as land at low tide for the purposes of measuring where the territorial limit actually began. Taken together, these two arguments had the effect of pulling Shivering Sands, a fort that had always been assumed to sit safely in international waters, legally back inside British territorial waters after all. This documentary will explain exactly what that meant for the station broadcasting from Shivering Sands when it reaches that part of the story properly. And there is one more piece of legal groundwork worth laying now, even though its full significance will not become clear until much later tonight in the chapters about Sealand, Britain's 3 nautical mile territorial limit, the very thing that made these forts legally reachable by pirate broadcasters in the first place, did not stay fixed forever. In 1987, Parliament passed the Territorial Sea Act, extending Britain's claimed territorial waters from 3 nautical miles all the way out to 12. This documentary is not going to explain yet exactly why that matters so much. For now, simply hold on to it, the way you have been holding on to Reginald Calvert's fate and Roy Bates's ambitions and the name Ruff's Tower as one more thread laid down quietly now that this documentary will pick back up and pull rather firmly before the night is through. And now let's go further into the story and further out onto the water to understand exactly why offshore pirate radio happened at all, why a whole generation of ambitious, occasionally reckless young broadcasters decided that the best way to reach the British public was to leave British soil entirely and set up shop on the sea. The root of the problem was fairly simple, even if its consequences were not. For most of the 20th century, the British Broadcasting Corporation held a legal monopoly over domestic radio broadcasting. There was, quite simply, no other lawful way to broadcast to a British audience over the airwaves, and the BBC, for all its genuine strengths, ran a famously cautious, tightly rationed approach to popular music. Needle time restrictions, negotiated with the musicians' union and the recording industry, sharply limited how much recorded pop and rock and roll the BBC was actually permitted to play across its schedules. For a British teenager in the early 1960s, hungry for the same energetic, guitar-driven, endlessly danceable music already transforming youth culture across the Atlantic, the BBC's output could feel painfully thin. There was demand. There was, in other words, a gap in the market, wide enough and hungry enough that a whole industry of entrepreneurs eventually stepped in to fill it, And they filled it in a way British law had simply never anticipated, by broadcasting from outside British jurisdiction altogether, from ships and from these abandoned wartime platforms, sitting in international waters just beyond the reach of British broadcasting law. For several years, through the middle of the 1960s, this worked. It worked well enough, in fact, to become a genuine cultural phenomenon, reshaping how an entire generation of young Britons listened to music and setting templates for radio presentation that the BBC itself would eventually absorb and imitate. Millions of listeners, by some estimates, tuned their sets to these unlicensed frequencies on any given evening, a scale of audience that made it very difficult for either the government or the established broadcasting establishment to simply pretend the phenomenon did not exist. Advertisers noticed too, drawn by audiences the BBC itself could not offer them, and that advertising revenue in turn gave several of these stations a financial life considerably sturdier than their improvised, slightly ramshackle origins might have suggested. But it could not last forever, because the British government, under mounting pressure from the recording industry, from established broadcasters, and eventually from public concern about the death of Reginald Calvert, which this documentary will tell you about properly very soon, moved to close the loophole for good. The law that did it was the Marine, etc., Broadcasting Offences Act of 1967. This documentary wants to be precise about its dates, because precision matters here, and the record is, happily, unusually clear on this point. The Act received royal assent on the 14th of July 1967 and came into force a month later, on the 14th of August 1967. You will occasionally see the 15th of August given instead in some secondary retellings of this story, and this documentary is not going to pretend that discrepancy does not exist, but the 14th of August is the date this documentary is going to treat as its primary reference point going forward tonight. What the Act actually did was, in its own way, quite clever, legally speaking. Rather than trying to directly police broadcasts happening outside British territorial jurisdiction, which international law made essentially impossible, the Act instead extended existing British law, building on the earlier Wireless Telegraphy Act of 1949, to criminalise the activity of British citizens and British companies who operated these stations, supplied them with equipment or fuel, advertised on them or otherwise assisted them in any material way. In effect, Parliament made it illegal to be a British person helping run, supply or advertise on a pirate station, even though the station itself remained physically outside British jurisdiction. This approach implemented a broader 1965 European agreement among neighbouring countries to close down offshore broadcasting collectively, rather than Britain trying to solve the problem entirely alone. The effect, once the Act actually came into force, was decisive. Nearly every major British offshore station shut down, unable to operate without British staff, British suppliers, and British advertisers to sustain them. There was one famous exception, Radio Caroline, arguably the most iconic of all the offshore pirate stations, responded by restructuring its business operations abroad, moving its corporate and financial arrangements outside British jurisdiction entirely, and managed to continue broadcasting for some years afterward, despite the new law, becoming in the process the single most enduringly famous name in the entire history of British pirate radio. And this is precisely the point in the story where this documentary needs to draw a very careful, very deliberate line, because it is a line that gets blurred constantly in popular retellings of this history, and blurring it would genuinely mislead you about what this documentary is actually about tonight. Radio Caroline was a ship-based station, full stop. Both its incarnations, Radio Caroline North and Radio Caroline South, broadcast from vessels, first a ship called the MV Caroline, later renamed Frederica, and subsequently the MV Mi Amigo. Never at any point in its history did Radio Caroline broadcast from a Monsell fort. The same is true of Radio London, which broadcast from a former United States Navy minesweeper called the MV Galaxy. And it is true again of Radio England and Britain Radio, two stations that shared studio space aboard a single vessel, the MV Olga Patricia, later renamed Laissez-Faire. None of these famous, frequently remembered stations ever set foot, so to speak, on one of Guy Mounsell's wartime towers. The fort-based stations were something else entirely, a smaller, less famous, genuinely distinct branch of the same broader pirate radio movement, operating on structures fixed permanently to the seabed rather than floating at anchor, and it is that branch specifically that is the actual subject of this documentary tonight. There is in fact a small but genuine advantage the fort-based stations held over their ship-based cousins, worth mentioning here before this documentary moves on. A fixed platform sunk onto a sandbank and standing on its own legs, does not drag its anchor in a storm, does not need refueling and resupply by tender in quite the same constant, weather-dependent way a ship at anchor does, and does not roll and pitch under its crew's feet the way even a well-anchored vessel inevitably will in the open water of the North Sea. Life on the forts was hard in its own particular ways, as this documentary will keep showing you tonight, but it was, at least, a steadier kind of hard than life aboard a ship, riding the swell month after month. So as this documentary moves forward now into the specific stations that broadcast from these towers, hold that distinction firmly in mind. If the name Radio Caroline is the one that comes to mind first when you hear the words pirate radio, and for most people it is, you are thinking of a different, if closely related, story. This documentary is about the towers. So now, with the wider legal and cultural picture in place, this documentary can take you properly, fort by fort, through the actual stations that broadcast from these towers, and it is going to do that carefully and in order, because each one had its own character, its own audience, and its own ending. Begin back where this documentary already introduced you to it, at Shivering Sands, the army fort out in the Thames estuary. You already know the bones of this story. Screaming Lord Such launched Radio Such there in May of 1964 with a transmitter reportedly salvaged from a wartime bomber and power drawn from car batteries, and by September of that year sold the operation to his manager, Reginald Calvert, who relaunched it as Radio City. What this documentary did not yet tell you is what Radio City actually sounded like on air day to day. Its core format was pop and rock music, aimed squarely at the young audience the BBC was failing to reach, but it was not simply a jukebox. The station also carried comedy sketches woven in between the records and an unusual regular segment built around listener complaints, giving Radio City a slightly ramshackle, personality-driven identity distinct from its more polished competitors. It also carried paid religious programming, evangelical broadcasts bought and paid for by outside sponsors, which, whatever you make of the mixture, provided a genuinely useful stream of income that helped keep the station financially afloat. Radio City continued broadcasting until the 8th of February 1967, when it closed at midnight, its final broadcast marked, fittingly, by the playing of the national anthem. This documentary asked you, back in the previous chapter, to remember the 1967 court ruling that reclassified the Thames estuary as a legal bay and pulled Shivering Sands back inside British territorial waters. That ruling is exactly why Radio City closed when it did, and it is worth noticing something precise here. Radio City's closure predates the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act's 14th of August commencement date by more than 6 months. This was not the famous act shutting the station down. It was a separate piece of legal action, working through a different mechanism entirely, arriving months before the wider law that most people associate with the death of pirate radio. This documentary wants you to picture that final midnight broadcast for a moment, because it is a genuinely poignant image once you sit with it properly. A crowded, ramshackle steel tower out in the estuary, its comedy sketches and listener complaints and paid sermons all finished now, its transmitter about to fall silent for good under legal pressure. The station's own listeners had no say in whatsoever, and then deliberately, almost ceremonially, the national anthem playing out over the airwaves one last time before the frequency simply went dead. There is a real dignity in that choice, whatever you make of the station's shoestring, improvised origins on the very same fort, 3 years earlier, moved now to Red Sands, another of the Army's Thames estuary forts, and a station history considerably more layered than Shivering Sands. The first occupants of Red Sands were Radio Invicta, broadcasting from roughly June of 1964 through February of 1965, followed by a station called King Radio, running from March through September of 1965. Neither of these early ventures achieved much commercial success, and both, in their own way, simply faded rather than ending with any real drama. What replaced them, though, became the most commercially successful of all the fort-based stations, and arguably the most interesting one, precisely because it refused to compete head-on with everyone else chasing the teenage pop audience. This was Radio 390, developed by a broadcaster named Ted Albury, beginning with test transmissions on the 23rd of September 1965 and moving into regular scheduled programming just 3 days later on the 26th of September. Albury made a deliberately different choice with Radio 390's format. Rather than pop and rock, the station offered easy listening, what its own publicity called sweet music, aimed not at teenagers, but at housewives and older listeners, a genuinely underserved segment of the British radio audience at the time. Even the language the station used for its presenters marked this deliberate distinction. Radio 390 called them announcers, never DJs, a small but telling signal of the calmer, more middle-of-the-road identity the station was cultivating. That gamble paid off. Radio 390 became commercially the most successful of the Red Sands ventures, attracting major national advertisers who wanted access to exactly the older, more affluent listenership the station had built. It broadcast until the 28th of July, 1967, closing shortly before the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act came into force, after what has been described as a protracted legal battle. Now back to Knockjohn, the Navy fort, where this documentary already introduced you to Roy Bates. When Bates selected Knockjohn as his base in late 1964 or early 1965, he did not arrive to an empty platform. On reaching the fort, he found that Reginald Calvert's Radio City organization had already landed some equipment there, using it as a secondary foothold beyond their main base at Shivering Sands. Bates, never a man inclined toward patience, with a rival encroaching on territory he considered his own, forcibly evicted Calvert's people from Knockjohn later in 1965. With the fort now under his sole control, Bates launched Radio Essex, beginning with test transmissions on the 27th of October 1965 and moving into regular programming on the 7th of November. Radio Essex claimed a genuine broadcasting first. It is reported to have been the first British offshore station to broadcast a full 24 hours a day, an ambitious, relentless schedule that set it apart from competitors still running more limited daily hours. But Radio Essex's legal troubles arrived well before the wider act did. On the 29th of September 1966, Bates was served a summons over illegal use of his transmitter. His response was characteristically bold. On the 6th of October, just a week later, he simply renamed the station BBMS, standing for Britain's Better Music Station, keeping the same format, the same staff, and effectively the same operation, running under a new name, a deliberate manoeuvre to sidestep the specific prosecution that had targeted Radio Essex by name. It worked for a while, but not indefinitely. On Christmas Day, the 25th of December, 1966, BBMS ceased broadcasting from Knockjohn, brought down not by the summons directly, but by a combination of dwindling funds and mounting legal pressure that had simply become too much to sustain. Bates and his team then moved their broadcasting equipment away from Knockjohn entirely, and this documentary wants you to notice this moment particularly closely, because it is the seed of everything that follows in the second half of tonight's story. The equipment went to a different fort. It went to Ruff's Tower. Before this documentary moves on, though, it wants to correct something directly, because this is one of the more common points of confusion in less careful retellings of this whole history, and getting it right matters. You will sometimes see it claimed that the station which followed Radio Essex onto Knockjohn, or which was somehow connected to Roy Bates's story more broadly, was a station called Britain Radio. This is a genuine and understandable mix-up, but it is incorrect. Britain Radio was a completely separate, unrelated station, sharing studio space aboard the ship MV Laissez-Faire, formerly the Olga Patricia, alongside its sister station Radio England, beginning in May of 1966 and playing its own easy listening format. Britain Radio had no connection whatsoever to Roy Bates, to Knockjohn, or to any Maunsell fort at all. It was, like Radio Caroline and Radio London before it, a ship-based station entirely. The station that actually followed Radio Essex on Knockjohn, under Bates's own continued leadership, was BBMS, not Britain Radio, and this documentary wanted to state that correction plainly and clearly, precisely because the conflation appears often enough elsewhere that it deserves a direct, deliberate answer here. So, by the close of 1966, the picture on the water looked like this: Shivering Sands, home to Radio City, still broadcasting, though its final closure was now only weeks away. Red Sands, home to the quietly successful Radio 390, still on air and still attracting national advertisers. And Knockjohn, now empty, its former occupants' equipment relocated to a fort this documentary has not yet properly introduced you to, a fort about to become, in the space of less than a year, the site of the strangest single event in this entire history. Now, this documentary needs to slow down considerably and tell you with real care the story it has been quietly promising you since its very first mention of Reginald Calvert. This is not an easy story, and this documentary is not going to soften it or rush through it, but it is going to tell it in order, precisely, because the sequence of events matters enormously to understanding what actually happened and why. The story begins with a man named Oliver Smedley, a figure worth understanding properly in his own right, before this documentary brings him together with Calvert. Smedley had served in the Second World War and had been awarded the Military Cross for his conduct in it. In peacetime he worked as an accountant, and he was also a committed political figure, standing as a Liberal Party parliamentary candidate on no fewer than 18 separate occasions over the course of his life, a persistence in electoral defeat that, in its own way, faintly echoes screaming Lord Such's own repeated candidacies, though the two men's politics and temperaments were otherwise nothing alike. In 1955, Smedley had also co-founded the Institute of Economic Affairs, a free market economic think tank that would go on to have a genuinely significant influence on British political and economic thought in the decades that followed, and in 1964, in the same restless wave of offshore broadcasting enthusiasm that produced Radio Such and Radio City, Smedley co-founded Radio Atlanta together with a broadcaster named Alan Crawford. Radio Atlanta did not remain independent for long. It later merged into the organisation built around Ronan O'Rahilly's Radio Caroline, becoming what listeners came to know as Radio Caroline South. So, by the mid-1960s, Smedley was an experienced, well-connected figure within the pirate radio world, and it was in that capacity that he became involved later in an attempt to broker a business merger between Radio City, Calvert's station out on Shivering Sands, and the Caroline organisation. As part of the negotiations toward that merger, Smedley supplied a transmitter to Shivering Sands, intended for Radio City's use, but the merger in the end fell through. And once it did, the transmitter itself became the centre of a genuinely bitter, entirely unresolved dispute. Calvert considered the transmitter defective and on that basis refused to pay for it. Smedley, for his part, considered the equipment still legally his property, since the deal it had been supplied under had never been completed. Neither man backed down. The disagreement festered, unresolved, for weeks, hardening, by all accounts, into real personal animosity on both sides. On the 20th of June, 1966, Smedley acted. He sent a team of hired riggers out to Shivering Sands, and they boarded the fort and either removed or disabled the disputed transmitter, reclaiming, in Smedley's view, property that was rightfully his. Calvert, predictably, was furious. The following day, the 21st of June, the confrontation escalated quickly and then, tragically, fatally. Calvert made a series of angry, threatening telephone calls to Smedley. Then, rather than leaving the matter there, he got in his car and drove to Smedley's home in the village of Wendon's Ambo in Essex, intending to confront him directly and demand that the fort's equipment be restored. This documentary wants you to notice, for a moment, how quickly an argument over a piece of broadcasting equipment, a transmitter, a piece of wartime surplus hardware, not so different in kind from the salvaged bomber transmitter Screaming Lord Such had once wired up on the very same fort, had within the span of a single day turned into something with the potential for real violence. Two men, both proud, both convinced entirely of their own rightness, both unwilling to simply let the matter drop, driving toward a confrontation that neither of them, in all likelihood, actually wanted to end the way it did. What happened next at Smedley's front door is described across the surviving accounts as a genuine physical struggle, a violent row breaking out between the two men right there on the doorstep. In the course of that struggle, Smedley retrieved a shotgun from inside his home and shot Calvert once, at close range. Calvert was killed. Smedley was arrested at the scene, and by the following morning he had been formally charged with murder. The trial that followed drew intense public attention, given both men's prominence in the world of offshore broadcasting. Smedley's defence rested on a claim of self-defence, that he had genuinely feared, in the moment of that violent doorstep confrontation, that Calvert intended to kill him. On the 18th of October, 1966, a jury heard the case and returned a verdict of not guilty, accepting the self-defence argument. One account of the trial describes the jury reaching that verdict in under a minute of deliberation, though this documentary offers that detail to you as a striking piece of the historical record, rather than something it can independently verify down to the precise number of seconds. The court, having acquitted Smedley, also awarded him his legal costs. Reginald Calvert's funeral took place on the 1st of July 1966 at St. Peter's Church in Dunchurch. Screaming Lord Such, the man whose own improvised radio venture had, 2 years earlier, started this whole chain of events on Shivering Sands, attended to pay his respects, along with members of one of the pop acts Calvert had managed during his career in the music business. It is a small, sad detail worth sitting with for a moment. The showman who began this particular fort story, standing at the graveside of the businessman who had taken his idea and tried, seriously, to build something lasting out of it. What did this shooting actually change in the wider arc of British broadcasting law? This documentary wants to be careful here too, because it would be easy to overstate the causal weight of a single tragic event. Calvert's death is widely seen, and this documentary deliberately chooses that phrase, widely seen, rather than presenting it as settled legislative fact, as a genuine turning point, one that accelerated the political and public pressure already building toward the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act. But it is important to remember from the previous chapter that this act was already the United Kingdom's implementation of a pre-existing 1965 international agreement among European nations to close down offshore broadcasting collectively. The legislative machinery, in other words, was already moving before Calvert died. What his death added was not the law itself, but urgency and negative publicity, and a genuinely tragic, headline-grabbing human story that made the case for closing the loophole considerably harder for Parliament and for the wider British public to ignore. This documentary frames it, then, exactly that way, not as the sole cause of the law that followed, but as a jolt of momentum and moral urgency added to a process that had already begun. And now, at last, this documentary can bring you to Ruff's Tower. The fort this documentary has been quietly asking you to remember since it first appeared briefly in the chapter on the wartime Navy forts, grounded back in February of 1942, the very first of the 4 Navy platforms to be put in place. It has waited patiently out on its sandbank a few miles off the Suffolk coast for its real story to begin, and this documentary promises you now that it is not going to disappoint, but it wants to tell that story in its full, genuinely layered sequence, because this is one of the places in tonight's history where a simplified version does real damage to the truth, and this documentary would rather take a little longer and get it right. This documentary asked you several chapters ago to think of Ruff's Tower simply as a name to hold on to, a detail waiting patiently in the background while wartime armaments and manning figures and combat records occupied the foreground of the story. It has been waiting a long time now, quietly out on its own sandbank, while this documentary told you about Such and Calvert and Bates's earlier career, about the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act and the court ruling that reclassified the Thames estuary. All of that groundwork was necessary because Ruff's Tower's own story only really makes sense once you understand everything that came before it. The abandoned forts, the legal gap in the 3-mile limit, the pirate broadcasters learning to exploit that gap, the Act finally closing it. Ruff's Tower absorbed all of that history into itself and then, remarkably, went somewhere none of the other forts ever went. The story does not, in fact, begin with Roy Bates at all. It begins a little earlier with a man named Jack Moore and his daughter Jane, who in 1965 climbed aboard the abandoned Ruff's Tower and quietly took up residence there, acting on behalf of an organisation associated with Wonderful Radio London, one of the ship-based stations this documentary mentioned briefly a couple of chapters ago. The Moors' occupation of Ruff's Tower, though, never actually produced a working radio station. No broadcasting ever took place from the fort under their watch. Whatever plans had originally brought them out to the tower simply never came together, and in time their presence there quietly lapsed, leaving the fort empty once again, ready unknowingly for its next and far more consequential occupant. That occupant was Roy Bates. This documentary left him, back in an earlier chapter, having just lost his broadcasting base on Knock John when BBMS ceased transmitting there on Christmas Day of 1966. Rather than giving up the pirate radio venture entirely, Bates moved his operation onto the now vacant Ruff's Tower, arriving there around the 24th of December 1966, bringing his broadcasting equipment with him. And here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates the story in an interesting way. Despite bringing that equipment out to Ruff's Tower with every apparent intention of resuming his broadcasts, Bates never actually got Radio Essex or BBMS back on the air from this new location. What began, in other words, as one more chapter in his pirate radio career, quietly became something else entirely before it ever properly restarted. Bates's hold on Ruff's Tower did not go unchallenged. On the 27th of June 1967, a rival raiding party organised by Ronan O'Rahilly, the driving force behind Radio Caroline itself, attempted to storm and retake the tower, approaching aboard a tender vessel called Offshore 2. This documentary wants to be explicit about the sequence here because it is easy in weaker retellings To compress this into a simplified story of Bates and O'Rahilly somehow occupying the fort together and then falling out, and that is not what the record actually shows. The Moors came first, representing Radio London's interests, and their occupation lapsed on its own. Bates came second, arriving independently onto an empty fort, and O'Rahilly's raid came third, later as an entirely separate attempt by a rival operator to seize a tower Bates now considered his own. Bates and his associates repelled that 1967 raid with genuine physical force, petrol bombs and whatever improvised weapons came to hand in the confusion of the moment, leaving at least one of the raiding party clinging desperately to a ladder on the side of the fort before eventually being rescued by lifeboat. Police did investigate the incident afterward, but in the end no charges were ever brought against anyone involved. Then, a little over 2 months later, on the 2nd of September 1967, Roy Bates did something no one else who had ever set foot on one of these forts had thought to do, or had dared to do, or perhaps had simply never had quite the right combination of nerve and imagination to attempt. He formally declared the independence of Ruff's Tower, proclaiming it the Principality of Sealand. Notice the timing here, because this documentary thinks it matters. That declaration came just 19 days after the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act had come into force, the same act this documentary described to you in detail a few chapters ago, the one that had already forced the closure of Radio City and Radio 390, and effectively made any resumed offshore broadcasting from Ruff's Tower a criminal enterprise under British law for any British national involved. It is a genuinely plausible reading of events, and this documentary offers it to you as exactly that, a reading rather than a proven motive inside Roy Bates's head. That the act had, in effect, closed off Bates's original path back into pirate radio, and that declaring the fort an independent nation was his way of finding an entirely different, a far more theatrical path forward instead. Where broadcasting was now illegal, sovereignty, strange as the idea sounds, was not obviously illegal at all. What was the legal reasoning behind the claim, such as it was? This documentary explained the mechanism to you back in the chapter on post-war abandonment, but it is worth restating plainly here, at the exact moment it matters most. In 1967, Britain's territorial sea still extended only 3 nautical miles from the coast. Ruff's Tower sat, by most accounts, somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 nautical miles off the Suffolk coast near Felixstowe, and this documentary is going to hedge that figure deliberately rather than hand you a single precise number, because the sources genuinely vary between roughly 11 and 13 kilometres, 6 to 7 nautical miles, depending on exactly which account you consult. What matters is the broader shape of the fact, not its last decimal point. The tower sat several miles beyond the old 3-mile limit, in what was, under the law as it then stood, unambiguously international water. On that narrow but real legal foundation, Bates built his claim. There is one further episode from these early Sealand years worth telling, because it has become a genuinely important part of how Sealand tells its own story, even though this documentary wants to examine it with a slightly more critical eye than Sealand's own retellings typically apply. In 1968, British workmen approached the tower in order to service a nearby navigational buoy, and Bates's son, Michael Bates, fired warning shots at them. The incident led to a firearms summons against Michael Bates, which a British court reportedly dismissed, ruling that the platform lay outside British territorial jurisdiction, and that the court therefore had no authority to hear the case. Sealand has, ever since, treated this dismissal as its first instance of de facto recognition, a phrase you will see repeated in one form or another across a great deal of Sealand's own literature and merchandise and official mythology. This documentary wants to be very direct with you about why that framing does not hold up to close scrutiny. A domestic court declining jurisdiction over a single firearms charge on the narrow technical grounds that the incident occurred outside the geographic reach of British criminal law at the time is simply not the same thing as any government anywhere formally recognizing Sealand as a sovereign state. It is an interesting, genuinely true legal footnote. It is not international recognition. That distinction belongs entirely to Sealand's own interpretive spin on its own history, and no government, then or since, has ever formally recognized Sealand as an independent nation. This documentary will return to that theme more than once before the night is through, because Sealand's talent for reframing small legal technicalities as grand diplomatic victories turns out to be one of the most consistent threads running through its entire history. Let this documentary take you a decade further forward now into a chapter of Sealand's history that reads, frankly, less like a footnote in maritime law and more like the plot of an adventure film. And this documentary wants to say clearly, right at the start, that this is precisely the point where you, as the listener, need to hold your skepticism a little closer than usual, because the sourcing here is genuinely different from almost everything else this documentary has told you so far tonight. By the late 1970s, Sealand had acquired what amounted to a small government of its own, at least in name, and among its self-styled officials was a German national named Alexander Achenbach, who held the title of Sealand's Prime Minister. Achenbach's relationship with Roy Bates, cordial enough at first, eventually broke down, and the accounts that survive point to a specific cause, a business scheme, reportedly involving German and Dutch investors, to develop Sealand into a casino and hotel venture, floating out there in the North Sea as a genuinely novel piece of speculative tourism. Whatever exactly went wrong between the two men over that plan, the falling out was serious enough that it eventually turned physical. In August of 1978, while Roy and Joan Bates were away from the fort, associates of Achenbach moved against Sealand directly. They arrived, by more than one account, by helicopter, and once aboard, they took Roy Bates's son, Michael, hostage, holding him on the tower for several days before eventually releasing him, though the precise conditions of that captivity, how he was treated, exactly what was said and threatened and negotiated during those days, vary somewhat depending on which telling of the story you consult. Try to imagine for a moment what that stretch of days must have felt like for Michael Bates himself, a young man who had already spent much of his life on this same rusting platform, who had once fired warning shots at approaching workmen a decade earlier, now suddenly a hostage on the very structure his own family called home, with no way of knowing how his father, hundreds of miles away, might respond, or how the standoff might end. Whatever the exact details of those days, the underlying fact is not in dispute. A genuine hostage situation playing out on a tiny self-declared nation that officially, in the eyes of every government on Earth, did not exist. Roy Bates's response, once he learned what had happened, was to retake the fort by force, and Sealand's own account of that retaking has, over the decades, become something close to a piece of internal folklore, complete with its own grand title, Operation Trident. As Sealand tells it, Bates chartered a helicopter for the assault, piloted, according to the story, by a stunt pilot who had previously worked on James Bond films, flying low and fast over rough seas toward the tower in a genuinely dramatic, cinematic recapture that ended with the occupiers surrendering. This is exactly the moment in the story where this documentary wants to pause and be completely transparent with you about where these details actually come from, because it matters, and because this channel's whole approach to history depends on being honest about that kind of thing, rather than letting a good story simply carry itself past scrutiny on momentum alone. Much of the more vivid, more cinematic specificity in this account, the helicopter, the Bond film stunt pilot, the low pass over rough seas, comes mainly from Sealand's own self-published telling of its own history, rather than from independent press coverage or court records compiled by anyone outside Sealand itself. That does not mean none of it happened. It very likely does describe in its broad outline something real. A hostage taking, a retaking of the fort, a resolution of some kind, but the specific colour and drama of the retelling is Sealand's own, told by Sealand about Sealand, and this documentary thinks you deserve to know that plainly before it lets the story wash over you as settled fact. What happened to Achenbach afterward is, in its own way, just as remarkable as the helicopter raid itself. Because Achenbach held a Sealand passport, a document issued naturally by the very micronation he had just attempted to seize control of. Bates had him charged with treason under Sealand's own self-declared legal system and held him on that basis. West Germany, taking an interest in the fate of one of its citizens, being detained on a rusting platform in the North Sea under charges brought by a country no government on earth recognized, sent a diplomat out to negotiate his release, and Sealand has, ever since, pointed to that diplomatic visit as evidence of a kind of implicit German recognition of Sealand's sovereignty, proof in Sealand's own telling that a real government had taken Sealand seriously enough to send an official representative to deal with it directly, nation to nation. This documentary wants to be just as direct about that claim as it was, back in the previous chapter, about the dismissed firearms summons. A far more ordinary, far more mundane explanation sits right alongside Sealand's preferred one, and it is, frankly, the more plausible reading of events by a considerable margin. West Germany's diplomat almost certainly travelled out to Sealand to provide simple consular assistance to a German citizen caught up in a hostage situation abroad, which is precisely the kind of thing consular officials are trained and expected to do for their nationals, wherever in the world they happen to end up in trouble, regardless of whether the territory holding them claims to be a sovereign nation, a private island, or a rusting fort with a self-appointed royal family. Sending a diplomat to check on a citizen in distress is not the same act, legally or diplomatically, as recognizing the government holding that citizen as a legitimate sovereign state. This documentary is not going to tell you Sealand invented the visit because it very likely happened. It is simply going to insist, gently but firmly, that you not mistake ordinary consular care for diplomatic recognition, because those are two entirely different things, wearing, in this one particular story, a very similar looking coat. Achenbach himself did not simply fade from the story after his release. He and an associate went on to establish a rival organization back in Germany, calling itself a Sealand government in exile, and that rival body continued for decades afterward to dispute Bates's legitimacy as Sealand's rightful ruler, running its own parallel, largely symbolic claim to being the true government of a nation that, in the eyes of every actual government on earth, did not technically exist at all. It is a strange thought to sit with for a moment. Two rival governments in exile, arguing for decades over rightful sovereignty of a place that no country in the world recognized as sovereign in the first place. And yet that is, in fact, precisely what happened, and this documentary finds something quietly moving in it, in its own way, the sheer human seriousness with which people will build and defend and fight over an idea, even one this small, even one this improbable, simply because it means something to them. And now let's go further still, forward through the decades, and see what actually became of Sealand once the drama of the 1970s had settled into something more like ordinary, everyday persistence, because that, more than anything else, is the truest word for what Sealand has done since persisted. It has remained occupied and claimed continuously since Roy Bates's original declaration in 1967, all the way through to the present day, and in all of that time, across more than half a century now, it has never once been recognized as a sovereign state by a single government anywhere in the world, not one. That fact is worth sitting with plainly, without embarrassment on Sealand's behalf, and without mockery either, because there is something genuinely admirable in the sheer stubbornness of an idea that has outlasted so many of the passing curiosities and news cycles that briefly noticed it along the way. Think for a moment about what that kind of persistence actually requires year after year, decade after decade. Someone has to keep the platform physically maintained against the constant, patient erosion of salt water and wind. Someone has to be present or arrange for someone to be present to keep the claim of continuous occupation genuinely true rather than merely nominal. Someone has to keep answering the same questions from journalists, the same curious letters from strangers around the world wanting to know how to become a lord or a baron of a country most of them will never actually set foot on. It is, in its own quiet way, a genuinely demanding, generations-long commitment, sustained not by any government's backing or any treaty's protection, but simply by one family's willingness to keep showing up for a claim most of the world still regards as an elaborate, charming joke. For much of its existence, Sealand has supported itself, at least in part, through the sale of novelty items tied to its self-declared nationhood, titles of nobility, lord and baron, and similar honorifics, sold to interested members of the public as souvenirs of a kind, along with its own coins and its own postage stamps, produced with real design care and sold as collectibles to enthusiasts of micronations and unusual corners of history alike. For a period, Sealand also sold what it called passports, and this is where this documentary needs to slow down and tell you about a genuinely serious, genuinely documented episode, because it is exactly the kind of corrective this channel believes matters, set against any romanticized idea you might otherwise form of simply buying your way into citizenship of a tiny sea-bound nation as a harmless lark. In 1997, the Bates family discovered that an international fraud and money laundering ring had been selling forged Sealand passports entirely without Sealand's knowledge or authorization to buyers around the world. The scale of it was substantial. An estimated 4,000 fake Sealand passports had been sold, reportedly mostly to citizens of Hong Kong, at a price in the region of $1,000 each, exploiting Sealand's obscure, ambiguous legal status to lend a thin veneer of plausibility to documents that were in reality worthless as genuine travel papers and dangerous to anyone who tried to use them as such. Once the Bates family learned what was happening, they revoked every Sealand passport that had ever been issued, cancelling the entire program outright rather than trying to sort legitimate holders from fraudulent ones. This documentary offers you that episode deliberately as a useful corrective, precisely because Sealand's whole story can so easily slide in the telling into something purely whimsical and charming, and the 1997 passport fraud is a sober, well-documented reminder that a legal grey zone, this genuine and this real, can attract serious criminal exploitation, not only harmless novelty tourism. There are a couple of other episodes from Sealand's more recent history worth mentioning here, though this documentary wants to hedge each of them appropriately as it goes. In 2006, a fire is reported to have gutted parts of the Sealand structure, causing significant damage to the platform, and Sealand has since said that the damaged sections were rebuilt and modernised in the years that followed. This documentary offers that account to you exactly as Sealand itself presents it, because independent verification of the fire's extent and the subsequent rebuilding is thin. So consider it plainly as Sealand says, rather than as independently confirmed fact. And in 2007, a widely circulated media story claimed that the file-sharing organisation, the Pirate Bay, was in the process of purchasing Sealand outright, intending to use it as a legally untouchable base for its servers. That story generated a considerable amount of press attention at the time, but on the balance of the evidence available, no actual change of ownership ever took place. This documentary flags that story to you specifically as an unrealised rumour rather than a historical fact, because it continues to circulate, even now in slightly garbled form, as though it had actually happened. There is one more legal thread this documentary needs to tie off properly, because it reaches all the way back to a promise made several chapters ago in the discussion of post-war abandonment. This documentary told you then that Britain extended its territorial sea from 3 nautical miles to 12 via the Territorial Sea Act of 1987, and asked you to hold on to that fact for later. Later has arrived. That extension, decades after Ruff's Tower was first declared independent, eventually brought the fort's physical location within the zone of water Britain now formally claims as its own territorial sea. And yet, in all the years since that extension took effect, the British government has not moved to enforce its claim against Sealand, has not sent officials or soldiers to dismantle the platform or force its residents off, has not, in any meaningful practical sense, treated Sealand as subject to ordinary British law and jurisdiction, the way the surrounding waters technically now suggest it should be. This documentary wants to be precise about what that actually means, because it would be easy to overstate it in either direction. The UK's practical restraint here does not amount to accepting Sealand's claim of sovereignty. No government document, no court ruling, no diplomatic statement has ever said any such thing. It looks far more plausibly like a government simply choosing not to spend its enforcement energy and political capital on a strange, largely harmless, more or less self-contained oddity sitting quietly a few miles off the Suffolk coast, when there is genuinely nothing urgent enough at stake to justify the effort of forcing the question. Benign neglect, in other words, rather than recognition. As for the Bates family themselves, their story softened in its own way into something gentler as the decades wore on. Roy Bates gradually withdrew from Sealand's active day-to-day affairs as he aged, and his son Michael, the same young man once held hostage during the 1978 coup and once summoned for firing warning shots at British workmen back in 1968, took on the role of Prince Regent, carrying the project forward into its next generation. Roy Bates himself died on the 9th of October 2012 at the age of 91 in a care home in Leigh-on-Sea in Essex after some years of living with Alzheimer's disease. A quiet, ordinary ending in an ordinary English town for a man whose life had included fighting through North Africa and Monte Cassino, fishing the Essex coast, running a pirate radio station from an abandoned wartime fort, and founding, quite genuinely, the strangest self-declared nation on the face of the earth. His wife, Joan Bates, who had stood beside him through nearly all of it, died a little over 3 years later on the 10th of March 2016 at the age of 86. This documentary has spent a long time now with the human side of this story, with engineers and showmen and businessmen, with a broadcasting entrepreneur shot dead on a doorstep in Essex, with a fisherman turned self-declared prince. It wants to slow down now for a little while and turn its attention back to the forts themselves as physical objects standing out there in the tide, because their fates turned out to be as varied and as individually strange as the fates of the people who occupied them, and this documentary does not want to let that part of the story go untold. Begin with Nor, the first of the 3 army forts protecting the Thames estuary, and the one this documentary told you several chapters back had actually been built within Britain's territorial waters, closer to shore than its siblings. Nor's ending was rough and, in the end, tragic. In 1953, the fort was damaged by a severe storm, weakening a structure that had already stood exposed to the North Sea's weather for over a decade. Later that same year, matters turned genuinely fatal. A Norwegian vessel called the Baalbek struck the fort, and the collision destroyed 2 of its towers outright, killing 4 civilians in the process. After that, with the structure now badly compromised and clearly judged a hazard to shipping in the busy estuary, Nor was dismantled entirely in the years 1959 and 1960. Of the 6 wartime army forts this documentary described to you earlier, Nor is the one whose ending came earliest and came with the highest human cost. Shivering Sands, home to Radio Such and then Radio City, suffered a different kind of accident, considerably less lethal but still genuinely dramatic. On the 7th of June 1963, a vessel called the MV Riebersborg collided with one of the fort's 7 towers in thick fog, and the impact brought that tower down into the sea entirely. Remarkably, no one was injured in the collision, but the fort itself was permanently altered by it, reduced from its original 7 towers down to 6, a stump from the lost tower remaining visible at the site to this day, a quiet physical reminder for anyone who sails past it now of just how easily even a structure built to withstand wartime bombing could be brought low by nothing more dramatic than bad visibility and an unlucky course. Sunkhead, one of the 4 original Navy forts, met an end that was, unlike Nor's or Shivering Sands's, entirely deliberate. On the 21st of August 1967, notice that date, coming just 1 week after the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act finally came into force, the Royal Engineers demolished Sunkhead outright, and they did so for a specific, pointed reason: to prevent the now empty fort from being reoccupied by a new wave of pirate broadcasters looking for exactly the kind of abandoned platform Roy Bates and Reginald Calvert and Screaming Lord Such had all made such creative use of in the preceding years. The demolition used a genuinely large explosive charge, reported in the region of roughly £3,200, though this documentary offers that figure to you as a round approximate number rather than a precisely audited one, given how these kinds of wartime and post-war demolition figures tend to travel imprecisely through secondary retellings. Whatever the exact tonnage, the effect was dramatic. The blast was reportedly felt and heard as far away as 14 miles from the site, a genuinely startling testament to the scale of the charge required to bring down a structure originally built to withstand the German Luftwaffe. Today, only the stumps of Sunkhead's legs remain above the water, the rest of it having been sent, quite deliberately, to the bottom of the estuary. Tongue Sands held on far longer than any of these, standing out on its sandbank for decades after the war and after its own brief pirate radio associations, before finally succumbing not to demolition or collision, but simply to time and weather. During storms on the 21st and 22nd of February 1996, Tongue Sands finally collapsed into the sea, nearly 3 decades after Sunkhead had been deliberately destroyed, and more than half a century after Tongue Sands itself had first been grounded back in 1942. What remains of it today is a single stump, roughly 18 feet in height, rising from the water where an entire fort once stood, the last physical trace of a structure that had, in its time, been credited in that hedged, imprecise way this documentary described earlier, with helping force one German E-boat into a fatal collision with another during the war. The Mersey forts, meanwhile, ended their story exactly as quietly as they had lived it. Having never seen enemy action of any kind during the war itself, the 3 towers guarding Liverpool's approaches were demolished by 1955, judged, like Nor eventually would be, a hazard to the busy shipping lanes running in and out of one of Britain's largest ports. No dramatic collision, no deliberate charge set to deny them to pirate broadcasters, since none of them were ever occupied by broadcasters in the first place. Simply a quiet, practical removal in keeping with the entirely uneventful military record they had held throughout their existence. Red Sands, though, stands apart from every other fort in this story, and this documentary wants to close this particular thread on its case specifically because it is genuinely the most hopeful chapter in this whole account of physical decline. Red Sands is the only one of the 3 Thames Army fort clusters to survive today as a complete set. All 7 of its original towers are still standing, still connected by their catwalks, still recognisably the same structure that once carried Radio Invicta, King Radio, and Radio 390 out over the airwaves to housewives and older listeners across southern England. That survival, though, comes with real and serious caveats. A structural inspection carried out in 2021 found that 6 of the 7 towers had developed severe structural defects, and the fort, in the condition it was surveyed in, was not judged safely accessible. What keeps Red Sands standing and what hope exists for its future rests largely with an organisation called Project Red Sand, a volunteer-run registered charity that functions in practice as the fort's de facto custodian, though this documentary wants to be precise about what that role actually means. Project Red Sand does not own the fort outright. The seabed beneath it belongs to the Crown Estate, and any major redevelopment of the structure would require formal consent not only from the Crown, but from the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, the Marine Management Organisation, and the Port of London Authority as well. A genuinely complex web of regulatory permissions for a charity working as most such charities do, with limited volunteer time and limited funding. Within those constraints, the reported work carried out at Red Sands has included the installation of a jetty and fendering system, ongoing interior maintenance, an access system built for one of the 7 towers, a diving survey of the underwater structure, and the securing of an original 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun for display, a genuine artefact from the fort's wartime role. Guided boat trips out to view the fort from the water, though not to land on it, are advertised to the public as a way of experiencing the structure firsthand. This documentary wants to draw one final, careful distinction here, because it is the kind of distinction that gets lost easily in casual retellings of Red Sands' more recent history. There have, over the years, been failed commercial redevelopment proposals for the fort, entirely separate from Project Red Sands' charitable conservation work, most notably a reported scheme, valued at somewhere in the region of £100 million, to convert Red Sands into a luxury hotel, a plan that ultimately collapsed when its investors withdrew their backing. That failed commercial venture and Project Red Sands' ongoing volunteer-driven preservation effort are 2 entirely separate threads, run by entirely separate people with entirely separate goals, and this documentary does not want you to conflate them. And even Project Red Sands' own conservation work, this documentary should say honestly, remains genuinely unfinished. Its public updates on recent completion milestones are relatively thin, and the fairest way to describe the current state of the project is simply as an ongoing, still incomplete volunteer restoration effort, carried forward by people who plainly care about the structure a great deal, working against the patient, indifferent pressure of salt water and time. Let this documentary ask you gently to consider something before it moves toward its close tonight. If you had heard of pirate radio at all before this documentary began, what image came to mind? Be honest with yourself, there in the dark, half asleep already, and this documentary suspects the answer for most listeners involves a ship, a gently rolling deck at anchor somewhere off the Essex coast, a record spinning on a turntable below decks. Possibly, if you know the story reasonably well, the specific name Radio Caroline, which has become, over the 60 years since it first went on air, something close to a national institution in its own strange, unofficial way, still broadcasting today in one form or another, still trading on a brand identity built in the middle 1960s that has simply never faded from British cultural memory the way so much else from that decade eventually did. That fame is not accidental, and this documentary does not begrudge Radio Caroline a single ounce of it. But it does want to point out clearly something this documentary has been quietly building toward all night. The fort-based stations you have just spent the last couple of hours learning about. Radio Such and Radio City out on Shivering Sands, Radio Invicta and King Radio and Radio 390 on Red Sands, Radio Essex and BBMS on Knock John are considerably less famous in mainstream British popular memory than their ship-based cousins, despite being every bit as real, every bit as well documented, and arguably every bit as strange and compelling as the stories that did become famous. Part of the reason for that gap, this documentary suspects, is culture rather than history. In 2009, the filmmaker Richard Curtis released a film called The Boat That Rocked, released in the United States under the title Pirate Radio, a fictionalized, deeply affectionate account of offshore pirate broadcasting in the 1960s, centered on a fictional ship called Radio Rock, anchored out in the North Sea, crewed by an ensemble of eccentric, larger-than-life disc jockeys. The film draws its inspiration quite openly from the ship-based pirate stations, from Radio Caroline above all, not from the forts. And this documentary wants to say this plainly, because it suspects at least some of you listening tonight have seen that film and enjoyed it. If you assumed before tonight that The Boat That Rocked was telling you the story, this documentary has just spent 2 hours telling you it was not. It is a wonderful, warm piece of cinema about a genuinely important part of British broadcasting history, but it is about the ships, not the towers, and the towers have never quite gotten their own equivalent moment in popular culture. Where then is the fort-based story actually documented for anyone curious enough to go looking after tonight? Mostly, this documentary can tell you honestly, in specialist places rather than mainstream ones. Dedicated archives built and maintained by genuine enthusiasts of this specific corner of broadcasting history. Principally a resource called the Offshore Radio Museum, which has done a great deal of quiet, careful work preserving photographs, recordings and first-hand accounts from people who were actually there on the forts in the 1960s. Beyond that, a small number of books have carried the story forward in print, including Michael Bates's own account of his family's extraordinary undertaking, titled Principality of Sealand, Holding the Fort, written from inside the story by the man who lived a significant part of it, and a more recent book by Dylan Taylor Lehman titled Sealand, The True Story of the World's Most Stubborn Micronation and Its Eccentric Royal Family, approaching the same material from outside as a journalist and researcher rather than a participant. This documentary looked, in preparing tonight's script, for a major, widely known feature documentary devoted specifically and solely to the fort-based pirate stations, as distinct from Sealand's own later story or from the ship-based Caroline mythology that has already been so thoroughly documented elsewhere, and did not find one it could point you toward with real confidence. So this documentary offers you its honest characterization of the state of the record, mostly specialist websites, dedicated books, and shorter journalistic retrospectives published around anniversaries, rather than one definitive film or series that has already told this exact story in full. Perhaps that gap is itself part of why this particular documentary wanted to spend an entire long, unhurried evening with you on this exact subject tonight. There is something worth noticing too in how differently these two strands of the same broad history have aged in public memory, because it is not simply a matter of which stations happened to be more commercially successful at the time. Radio Caroline had a name that was warm, human, easy to say and easy to remember, attached from the very beginning to a founder, Ronan O'Rahilly, who understood the value of mythology and cultivated it deliberately, keeping the Caroline name alive and relaunching it again and again across the decades whenever circumstances allowed. The fort stations, by contrast, tended to carry the names of the sandbanks they sat on, or the initials of whichever consortium happened to be running them that year: Radio Invicta, King Radio, BBMS, names with a kind of bureaucratic, workaday flatness to them that never quite lodged themselves in the popular imagination the way Caroline did. It is a small thing, a matter of branding almost, and yet this documentary suspects it goes some way toward explaining why one strand of this shared history became legend while the other became, at best, a footnote known mainly to specialists. If any single element of tonight's story has broken through into wider public awareness, it is not the wartime guns, and it is not the pirate broadcasters, colourful as they were. It is Sealand. Ask almost anyone even passingly interested in strange geopolitical trivia to name a micronation, and Sealand is very likely to be the first and often the only name they can produce. It is a routine fixture of world's smallest country listicles and micronation roundups across the internet, endlessly recirculated, endlessly good-natured in its retelling. The kind of story that gets shared precisely because it sounds too strange and too charming to be entirely true, and yet, as this documentary has shown you tonight, largely is. In the early 2000s, Sealand briefly found itself associated with a data haven and internet hosting venture called Haven Co., an ambitious attempt to use Sealand's ambiguous legal status as a haven for servers operating outside the reach of any recognized nation's data laws, a scheme that captured a burst of tech press attention at the time, in keeping with Sealand's long-running talent for attracting exactly this kind of imaginative, boundary-testing project. So here, at the close of this particular thread, is where things actually stand tonight, as honestly as this documentary can leave it with you. Red Sands offers organised boat trips today for anyone curious enough to sail out and see, with their own eyes, the last complete cluster of Guy Mounsell's army forts still standing in the Thames estuary, though direct landing on the fort itself remains limited, given its fragile and still unfinished condition. Sealand, meanwhile, remains privately controlled by the Bates family to this day, not open to casual visitors in any meaningful sense, a genuinely private, genuinely occupied, genuinely unrecognized nation of its own, sitting quietly out on its sandbank, exactly where Roy Bates left it. Let this documentary bring you back, now, to where it began tonight. To that first image, the rusting steel tower on its thin legs, standing alone in grey water, seabirds nesting where anti-aircraft crews once stood watch through the night. You have travelled a long way from that opening image over the last couple of hours, through wartime engineering and improvised pirate broadcasts, and a shooting on a doorstep in Essex, and a helicopter raid straight out of an adventure film. And this documentary hopes, if your eyes have not already closed, that you can now look back at that same tower and see something richer in it than you could have seen at the very start of tonight, because that is really what this whole evening has been about in the end. Not simply a list of dates and names, though there have been a great many of both, and this documentary is grateful to you for staying with all of them so patiently. It has been about a single, quietly extraordinary structure, or rather a small family of structures, scattered across 2 English river mouths, that lived through 3 entirely different lives in sequence, each one almost impossible to predict from the one before it. Built to kill. That was the first life, urgent and grim, born out of a country's real fear of what might come flying up the Thames and the Mersey in the dark, crewed by well over 100 men at a time, doing a hard, watchful, often tedious job that occasionally, credited if imprecisely, made a genuine difference. Then, when the guns fell silent and the towers were simply left standing on their sandbanks because pulling them down cost more than anyone cared to spend, they were found again by an entirely different kind of person and given an entirely different kind of life. Built this second time to entertain, to blast pop music and easy listening and comedy sketches and paid religious programming out across the water to a British public the BBC had never quite learned to serve, run by showmen and businessmen, and in one deeply sad case ended by a shotgun on a doorstep, in a case this documentary told you as carefully and as completely as it could manage. And then on just one of these towers, out of everything else that might have happened to it, a third life arrived that nobody, least of all Guy Mounsell, drafting his blueprints in 1941, could possibly have foreseen. declared quite seriously by a wounded veteran of North Africa and Monte Cassino, turned Essex fisherman, turned pirate broadcaster, to be a nation, its own flag, its own currency, its own self-appointed royal family, still there today, still unrecognized by a single government on earth, and still somehow simply refusing to stop existing. Sit with that arc for a moment here at the end, the way this documentary has asked you to sit with so many of its images tonight. A gun platform, an outlaw radio kingdom, a sovereign nation of one small stubborn family, 3 lives lived out by the same rusting steel within the span of less than a single human lifetime. Within, in fact, almost exactly the lifetime Roy Bates himself lived, born in 1921, dying in 2012, having personally witnessed and shaped 2 of those 3 transformations with his own hands. There is something in that which this documentary finds genuinely moving, and it hopes some small part of that feeling has settled into you as well, somewhere in this last hour of quiet listening. The sense that history is not only made by nations and armies and famous men in famous rooms, but sometimes by a handful of stubborn, restless, ordinary people deciding almost on a whim that a half-forgotten wartime relic sitting empty in the tide deserved a second chance at meaning something, and then, when that ran its course, deciding it deserved a third chance as well. Think too, one last time, about all the other towers this documentary walked you through tonight, the ones whose stories ended more quietly, more ordinarily than Ruff's towers did. Nor, struck by a storm and then by a ship, its towers destroyed, 4 lives lost, dismantled at the end of the 1950s. Shivering Sands reduced from 7 towers to 6 by a collision in the fog, a stump still standing today as the only visible reminder of the tower that broadcast Radio Such's very first gloriously improvised transmission. Sunkhead, deliberately blown apart by the Royal Engineers to keep it out of pirate hands, felt for miles around, Tungsands finally giving way to nothing more dramatic than an ordinary winter storm, 3 decades after everyone had stopped paying it any real attention. The quiet, uneventful Mersey forts, torn down without ever firing a shot in anger. And Red Sands, still standing all 7 towers together, cared for as best a small band of volunteers can manage against the patient, indifferent pressure of the tide. Every one of those endings, this documentary thinks, deserves to be remembered alongside Sealand's stranger, more famous fate, not as a lesser story, simply as a different way the same wartime promise could end. You do not need to remember any of the dates now. You do not need to remember which fort belonged to the Navy and which belonged to the Army, or which station played pop music and which played sweet music for housewives, or exactly how many nautical miles separated Ruff's Tower from the Suffolk coast. This documentary has carried all of that for you tonight, carefully, and it is content to go on carrying it, so that you do not have to hold on to any of it as you drift off. All you need to carry with you, if anything at all, is that image from the very beginning. A rusting tower, alone in grey water, that was once a fortress, and then a radio station, and then, against every reasonable expectation, a kingdom. You have done enough for one night. You have listened closely and patiently and kindly to a strange and true and occasionally sad story about towers in the sea, and that is no small thing to have given your evening to. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever room, whatever country, whatever quiet corner of the world you have chosen to close your eyes in, this documentary is glad you were here for it, and it would love, sometime, to know where that was, when you have a spare moment and feel like sharing. But not tonight. Tonight, there is nothing left to do but rest. Let the tide go on doing what it has always done, out there in the Thames estuary, patient and indifferent and endless, wearing away at steel that has already outlasted so much more than anyone ever expected it to. Let your own thoughts do the same, slow and soft, wearing away at wakefulness until there is nothing left of it at all. Good night, sleep well,